Hello. So welcome to our final session of Bible Month. Thank you so much for those of you who've joined us for the entire experience. It's really good to have made it this far, I think. And I don't know about you, I have been chatting to the team, and I think we've all been pleasantly surprised by just how much there has been in the text to ponder, to probe, to enjoy exploring. I think we've all found it an even more fruitful exercise than we necessarily imagined we would have, which is excellent. I hope you feel the same way too. One of the things we've been trying to do for the last few weeks is approach the text from a number of different angles with a number of different lenses. We've been particularly keen to explore the idea that we are better readers of the text and we are more faithful Christians as we acknowledge that we bring our own biases and our own agendas, our own lenses to the text. And actually, it's helpful and formative for us to hear other people's biases and agendas and lenses, not necessarily so that we have to agree with everything that they say, but because actually it forces us to realize that the Spirit is at work in them and brings stuff alive in them that we might not necessarily be conscious of ourselves. So as we start today, I thought it would be a helpful reflective exercise for those of you who've been with us for the whole journey to just pause for a moment and think, what is the lens that I personally have brought to the text? Now that I've had an opportunity to recognize it might be different from what other people bring, how might I describe my own lens? What are the biases I bring? What's the agenda I bring? What do I assume the central message of this book is about? And how do I read it? How does that shape how I read it? So what I'd like to do is actually, we'll do the Zoom equivalent of turning to the person next to you, which means I'm going to stick you all in breakout rooms briefly with one other person and just give you a couple of minutes to have a chat about those questions. What is the lens that you bring to the text? So I'll pop you in those rooms now, and I will hopefully see you in a couple of minutes. Give me a second. All right, see you shortly. What lens do you bring to the text? Excellent. Well, welcome back. Hopefully you had a brief moment there to explore the idea of the lens that you bring to the text. And today we got Nigel specifically with us, who's going to be sharing his very particular lens that he brings, which I think is a helpful, it's going to be a helpful balance from some of the other approaches that we've had so far this month. So Nigel, do you want to introduce yourself briefly and maybe describe the lens that you particularly bring to your reading of Ruth?
Yes, that's good. If you don't know me, my name's Nigel. I work with Michael doing the same job. I'm aligned to the Nottingham and Derby district rather than the Northampton district. My passions in the learning network, if you like, are around pioneering, new place for new people, coaching people, and vision and so forth. And the lens I bring to this has really kind of come out of studies over the years, doing a PhD and being genuinely interested in trying to make the world a better place. I know that's very cheesy, but it's a very political lens, a social, economic lens I kind of come at this from. So I hope that's okay. I know some people have touched on some of those things already, but hopefully in our conversation, and we are going to try and have a bit more of a conversation if that works. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, it's very much a lens which I think has much to say to us today about migration, marginalization, immigration, and all those kind of things. And justice is the lens I'm kind of looking at it through, if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds great. I think I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Do you want to say a little bit more about those lessons then? Do you want to start to kind of like give us the headlines of how you see, or what particular lessons you see at work in the text generally?
Okay. Yeah, the Old Testament makes me nervous, if I'm really honest. I'm much happier in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels. I was reflecting with Michael the other day that I've really enjoyed diving into the book of Ruth to unpack some stuff. So hopefully we can bring some things. I'm kind of concerned really that we do ourselves and perhaps those we serve a disservice if we just bring one dynamic to how we look and engage with Scripture. So hopefully we can have a slightly different angle, looking today at values, at economic systems, how we might do education, the culture we live in. My favourite definition of politics came from 1936 by a guy called Harold Laswell, and he said it's about who gets what, when, and how. Who gets what, when, and how. And so I think this is very much a book for all the characters about who gets what, when, and how. And particularly today, looking at these three overarching ideas around mission, migration, an invitation to those people who may in some way might be different to us. And I'm going to do it in a particular way that I'm going to try and blend my experience of these things by referring to some of my work with refugees in northern France with some of the lessons from Ruth. But we might keep pausing and ask people to chip into that conversation, to share their own experiences and insights. Because I work much better and I'm much happier when we have dialogue and ongoing debate. I'm very happy for you to disagree with anything I say. My normal joke is, you can do that, but you'd be wrong. But that is just a joke, so I just offer that. You're very welcome to have a different perspective as we go forward.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, if you do want to push back, or if you do have questions, please use the chat function in Zoom. So do pop a question in there, and I'll make sure that kind of we can flag it up as we go, or do push back, and maybe Nigel can springboard off of any kickback that he gets. But let's try and have a bit of a fluid dynamic. But Nigel, do you want to launch into some of the stuff, particularly around mission and migration, and some of your story and your history, and how you see that correlating to what we witness in the story of Ruth?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's stating the obvious, but I think it's almost, the first verse starts about there's a famine and we've got some people migrating because there's a sense of urgency around that. I was checking this out today. It's kind of interesting that the word used is to sojourn, which is a temporary migration, which is kind of added a bit more of the text for me, really. But, to delve into it, Ruth's a foreign worker. She's a migrant worker. It's all about people on the move. I think if there's a lesson for us today, not everyone, but there's a tendency for us to be very static in our service of God. We might stay in one place for a long, long time, and we might not travel anywhere. So there's something about movement and mission, which I think is important. Ruth had choices, like we all do, to stick with family or go a different way, or new family, to journey to something new, a constant sense of appraising the situation and making a decision. And it wasn't lost on me, some of those decisions might be today how we look at mission. Do we were talking earlier, weren't we? Do we go back to how we were, or do we move to a new place when lockdown ends, in a different culture, to see how that all works? And it's a story I think I touched last week in our breakout room. It's a story of struggle. People are struggling at the moment. People, just like in the book of Ruth, are wrestling with all sorts of issues: famine, poverty, loss, relationships, prejudice, who's in, who's not in, exclusion, and all those sorts of things. And for some people, this whole subject, if you find yourself in it, either in a lockdown or in, the sense of movement, there's a perilous vulnerability, really, when you leave your norm and end up in an unknown. You're damned if you stay to one extent, and you're damned if you go. So I think that's a big challenge for many. And I've always been fascinated about how people survive when they cross borders and cultures. One of my colleagues in the Nottingham and Derby district shared a poem, an Indian poet, Bhanu Kapil, just last week, which really struck to me. There's a line in it which says, when you're always a guest in someone else's culture, it's exhausting. And I just went, Do you know it is? 5 minutes of me trying to speak French in a French supermarket, and I'm worn out because I'm really, really bad at languages. But it can be very exhausting, I think, in a different culture. And then we've got lots of issues, aren't we, which are right bang up to date, really, in terms of who's got privilege, who's got power, who's got supremacy, how's diversity handled. We've touched on these things, I know. And beyond that, to me, which is one of the true tests around, I'll call it racism, but the language isn't very helpful. There's a difference to me between accepting all people and valuing diversity, but then having those people as our friends. I know I've got lots of black friends who say, how many friends have you got who are of colour? How often do they come round for a cup of coffee or a meal? I think who we invite into our lives in terms of that invitation is really a key thing for me. And if we get to this, there's a lot in the book of Ruth about laws and rules, and we've had all of that, haven't we? We have it in my refugee work in France. We've had it all about when is it okay to damage something, and when is it really not okay to damage something? Why does someone who damages a statue have to face the full force of the law, but someone who does something irresponsible around language, nothing seems to happen to them? And perhaps the Methodist message just for us as Methodists, how do we go beyond saying all are welcome so that we kind of get to that place Ruth got to, that unswerving commitment to one another, perhaps? Just as an introductory kind of few thoughts. Is that okay? Does anyone want to come back on that?
Well, Navette wants to say something. Navette, yeah, do you want to chime in?
Just the word that Nigel used about exhausted, as I've been listening to comments that have been made online through George Floyd, that word just kept coming up and up and up again from the African Americans, that they're just so exhausted with the situation and feeling as though they are people from outside their own society, though they've been there from the very beginning of American society. They just feel exhausted.
Yeah.
Listening to Navette, I'm struck to my core around the position of privilege I have, because we do attempt to try and make some of our committees more inclusive by trying to represent the diversity of our local churches. But actually, I've never been exhausted by inviting people, because actually I might ask them once or twice and they'll say no because they're not unsure. And then I just drop it and I realise that's privilege. Actually, I should be exhausted by constantly asking them, reassuring them, please come on, please do. And that's where I should be, so that they are not exhausted by trying to get in the door. That should be my job.
Cool, thank you.
I mean, one of the things I love that comes out just in those kind of starter points is that what you bring to the text, and one of the gifts I think you have as you study is you can instantly springboard into people's reality, and you instantly want to explore, okay, how does this play out in the real world, in inverted commas? And you're very good at wanting to read your own and other people's experiences into the text in a way that brings things to a kind of more grounding, bypassing those lovely images and trying to get to the heart of something. And I know that particularly on the theme of migration, obviously one of the things that you're bringing there for it is stories of your work with refugees in northern France. So I just wondered if you wanted to chat a little bit more about that, just to give people the backdrop.
So yeah, just a quick dip in. I first went to northern France to work as a volunteer for an organisation called Care for Calais, 2016-17. I actually can't remember how I got involved with them. I just felt drawn to having to do something, really. I'd been on holiday to France, as perhaps you may have. I'd seen Calais turned into a fortress around the docks and the train station bits, mainly paid for by UK taxpayers. And I saw people in deep distress. So perhaps that's what motivated me. I went to get involved, met all sorts of people over the time. I've made about 4 or 5 visits. Each time I go, I'm exhausted and I'm only helping. It's a kind of a desperate situation, really, I think, all the time in my experience. Just to paint a quick picture, the charity is very well organised. We tend to spend the mornings packing up food supplies. There's my wife, top left picture. 3 Generate, I collected a load of sleeping bags at 3 Generate a couple of years back and took them. I've done it 2 years now, and we dropped those off. And so we just try and help very simply, really, with very practical things. It often comes down to keeping people alive. I know that's kind of very altruistic and naive, but perhaps there's some empathy with Ruth. You know, people in desperate situations do different things, really. Just a couple of things. We can have a distorted view, and I can only tell you what about France. So the people I've met, some of them are fleeing famine, just like the characters we read about in Ruth. Some of them have been bombed by Western forces, including our own army and air force, which is kind of ironic, as well as other people. They've seen murders. They're perhaps under threat. They might have been persecuted for their faith. They might have seen sexual violence. So there's a whole host of reasons why people are in the situation they're in. And some simply want a better life for their family, and maybe seeking better economic kind of situations. And again, perhaps drawing on the story, their needs in northern France are very simple: food and water, shelter, a sense of security. And most of them want to be with family. They've either got family in the UK or they've got family back home who they're wanting to come to the UK to support. And if you're into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a few technical problems with it, but we'll just accept it as it is for now. They're very much at the bottom of it. It's about survival. And so those kind of things really are at the back of my mind as we kind of go forward. One of the things I always find interesting is, and again, maybe you were different to me, maybe you're better than me. I had a kind of a naive view about refugees before I went, and maybe that's one of the things I'd dissuade us from jumping to conclusions about Ruth and the characters in it. So they do want, these are trendy young men, most of them, they do want trendy haircuts. So you see top right, haircutting is one of the things which we facilitate when we go. They do want to wear particular clothes. Because they're in their 20s doesn't stop them being aspirational to wearing trendy jeans, etc. They can't always get those, obviously, and this guy here has no shoes. He wears flip-flops all the time because he hasn't got any shoes. But again, I just kind of thought, oh yeah, they'll be grateful for anything, but people aren't wired like that. These are highly intelligent, often young men who are perhaps multilingual, perhaps highly educated, very resilient. They've traveled thousands of miles. I don't know how Ruth and Naomi traveled, but you know, these guys have traveled a long way, often walking in very difficult situations. So those things have surprised me. They've nearly all got mobile phones because that is their only place of contact with family back home or family elsewhere. So that's very important. So we provide lots of charging points too, really. But there's also a desolation, and perhaps back to the text, you know, Naomi's change of name to bitter. If ever I met a bunch of people who had the right to be bitter, it would be some of the refugees. We may touch this later, but you probably don't know this unless you've read the reports. But again, the UK taxpayer funds a lot of the French police security operation. And they're not the normal French police. They're what's called the CRS, which is the French riot police. And so, just go to the pictures. The French riot police are heavily armed, extraordinarily fit. They occupy all the hotels in Calais, and you'll see them doing press-ups on the concrete steps. You'll see them running with backpacks on. And they're just incredibly violent towards the refugees. They destroy all their possessions. They slash their tents. They pour petrol on their belongings. And the bottom right picture, which is a lorry, the dust cart skip lorry, is after a raid on a camp where they just bulldozed everything into the back of the lorry and carted it away. And so depriving the refugees of all things. So all those things are quite disturbing. And again, just as a reminder, you know, our taxes pay for most of that, as I kind of said. So, I'm trying to join up some of the experiences of these guys and what I've observed with some of the text. So we'll see where we go. But do come back to me.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you draw some of those connection lines. I mean, you did a little bit there with Naomi and her name change, and actually recognizing that people who have faced horrific disaster and have to develop resilience because of external circumstances, it's understandable if they develop bitterness. And what are some of the connection lines between your experiences and the text? How do you think your work in Calais has enabled you to get to grips better with the story of Ruth?
I think it's caused me to get into the minds of some of what goes on. Again, when we see the pictures, we either see two pictures in the media predominantly. One is one of acute suffering when perhaps a child dies. There's been a couple of those over the last few years which have gone viral, if you like. The other one is when there's some political debate. But the thing which has helped me most when I've looked at this is the kind of refugees and all the characters in Ruth, they are all God's children, made in God's image, wonderfully made. And it's the humanity which has got to Sue and my wife every time, really. You know, that we see their humanity. Ironically, most of them aren't bitter that we've met. They're very humble. They're very, very grateful. They're immensely appreciative and respectful of everything everyone does for them. And I've never seen any of them respond to the violence they experience with violence. And again, you know, there's some things in the story, isn't there, we've played around with in Ruth, how violence works and threat of violence and all those kind of things, really. I think there's also, I know we've kind of asked the question, where's God? And I've asked, where's God in northern France, I have to say. It doesn't kind of seem right to me, really. But the thing which is, you know, none of us are empty vessels waiting to be filled. Again, I think we can presume that to be the case. We might have presumed it with Naomi. We might have presumed it with Ruth. But I don't think we are. We all bring a certain sense of who we are to the party, if you like. That ability to survive, that sense of determination, I think is interesting. And this is kind of one which is struck me with the Calais folks, looking around here. Many of the guys are people of faith, you know, and there's a sense that all the characters, we could argue, in the book of Ruth are people of faith, might be different faiths. So I just for fun, the guy in the bottom right is a Muslim. I want you to picture the scene. It's October half term, so it's about October the 20-something. It's freezing cold, and it's been raining for round about 3 days. He came to a water station. He did his ritual washing. He put this towel down on this pallet, and he began to do his praying. And I'm just reflecting on Howard's thing of someone wouldn't travel 6 miles for something. This is a man of faith who is from the Muslim faith, quite admittedly, but his dedication to carry on his life and journey of faith. I was just humbled. I can't be bothered to go to most prayer meetings, let alone do all of that, really. And then the one on the left is a little shrine in a forest, which the charity came across. People had dedicated. And the guy at the top right, who's on his phones, you might not see there, but he's the white thing around his neck is rosary beads and a big cross on it. And so people are much happier to wear their faith publicly, perhaps. And again, it's conjecture, isn't it, as to what was going on with Ruth and faith and all those sorts of things. But I just think there's some parallels there, really.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, go on.
No, sorry, carry on.
And again, I've touched on it a little bit, but, people in the story of Ruth were either under constant threat of brutality or actual brutality. And again, that's what I've seen. The police work all night. They'll often put helicopters up in the air at night just to wake the refugees up. They won't let them sleep if they can help it. So they're constantly exhausted, constantly on the move. So if you're around Calais late at night, you will, police go out, you will see all the time. And they do intimidating things. I was thinking about the people, Boaz trying to protect people, saying, look after yourself, don't be intimidated, don't go here, don't go there. The French police, they turn up dressed to the hilts with pepper sprays, guns, and they put these plastic boots on for fear of contamination, which is kind of ridiculous because they've got huge boots on, really. But again, to me, it's a very intimidating and derogatory thing to do, to just kind of say to people, you're unclean, you're not welcome. And again, I make the point for the third time, our taxes are paying for most of this policing, which I just find quite difficult, really.
And we're, I think that highlights again some of the conversations we've had in previous weeks as to how much do we perpetuate the system. We talked a lot about power and privilege and understanding how much we can perpetuate tricky power dynamics. And one of the distinguishing features of Boaz seems to be his going against the grain in that sense. And I know that it's been one of the things that the church that I was a part of in Derby for a number of years used to do quite a lot of was contextual Bible studies with the refugees that we worked with, and many of whom were new to the Christian faith, and trying to work out, inviting them, I suppose, to share the parallelisms of kind of, what would a Boaz in your context look like? How would you define a Boaz if your starting point is, say, taking the border police and then, re-envisioning the story from that point of view. And it was incredibly humbling because it was a great way of them being able to share some of their story rather than us assume it. And it was a helpful springboard both to explore faith with them, but also to just hear their experience and validate it and try and understand it, even as we fail to empathize, because it's so different to what we're used to, I suppose.
As you say, the problem of adapting to a new culture is a very important one, and also feeling that they are diminished by the new culture, the way that I believe they cannot work, for instance, and so on and so forth. But also there is the problem that between themselves, like any other society, any other people, they themselves they themselves have factions, and they might not agree with each other. We assume that refugees are a bulk of people, that they all agree with each other and so on and so forth. We put them all in the same bag, but they in fact are not. And that is something that we have to face as well, I think.
Yes, very true. Certainly when the jungle existed in Calais, it was very divided around ethnic roots. Different parts of the jungle were occupied by people of different ethnicities. And again, now we go to different parts in and around Calais and Dunkirk, and you will find, for example, the Kurds are very much around Dunkirk. You will find the Afghan, Pakistani ethnic groups in other parts of Calais. So yeah, it's very true. We have to be realistic too. There are some people out for ill gain. There are Albanian gangs at work who do trafficking, who infiltrate the refugees to try and make money and cause problems. So hopefully I'm not being naive in what I've said. And as we've seen in Glasgow and perhaps Reading, when it goes wrong, it really goes wrong because of perhaps some of the things we've talked about. But equally, there's been some amazing stories of people in the NHS, Syrian doctors, nurses from different parts who've done a fantastic job. And I really hope it's changed some people's views, really.
So pulling us back to the text a little bit, if that's okay, are there other kind of particular resonances then that you see at work in Calais and then in the story?
Anne Morrissey, who some of you might know, she did a podcast a couple of months back, really. And she said the labeling and the belittling and the laughing and the demeaning of people other than ourselves or people from different countries or areas. She said it's the sociological crossroads to stories and worldviews that poison our understanding of others. And I thought I was very challenged by what she said, that when we do make jokes, and I make a lot of jokes, hopefully not about race, but a lot of other things, we can poison understanding. So I think, again, we did it in our team when we first started looking at this. We were kind of, obviously you've heard where Jane's at, you've heard where Michael's at, you've heard where Jill and myself are at. We had lots of banter around different viewpoints, but sometimes that banter can just be poisonous. So I just wanted us to watch that, really, in the text, perhaps. Another reflection from parallels is, I touched on it earlier with the guy in the flip-flops. I don't know if you can imagine, but when you're a refugee, other than the actual physical ground, there's nowhere to sit. You are on your feet virtually all the time. If you want to come to one of the places where food's distributed or hair is cut or clothes are offered or a sleeping bag is given out, you have to walk there. And I was thinking again about, the family originally traveling because of the famine and then traveling back. And I'm guessing, I'm guessing they would have walked, or perhaps donkey or camel, I don't know, mule or something. But again, it's not a great experience. And something very alien, I think, to us, that when you're on your feet all day, that it's quite draining again, I think. I've also been struck by the family thing. That, we touched a lot on this over the last few weeks, haven't we? The relationships with Ruth, Naomi, and the loss of husbands and wives and fathers and all of that. Sorry, not wives. But there's a strong family bond amongst refugees. They do look out for each other, and they often have family in different parts of the world, which it's certainly stronger than my family bond, let's put it that way. And again, it's a great asset, I think, is one of the things I've been pondering in the story. I was struck also when I was looking at this, and I read it again this morning, when Ruth fell prostrate face down in front of Boaz. I've mentioned earlier the gratitude modern day refugees show, and I've seen the equivalent of that lying down, really, in France. People just so grateful for a cup of tea, preferably with 5 or 6 sugars in, because that's how it works, because it gives you energy and sustenance. But the gratitude, is just, we have so much in the West, or most of us do. And again, that sense of those who have and those who haven't is something I've been pondering, really. And finally, I know we touched on this too. I'll just pause with this one, perhaps. The law is interesting, isn't it? The law in the story of Ruth's interesting. There's been some debates about what was legal around marriage and all those things, but the law is a bit of an ass, really, when it comes to refugees. I've got my T-shirt on. I'm going to stand up. There's a guy who sells these for the charity I work with. He's sold about £40,000 worth, I think, to raise money. It's a picture of Paddington Bear, and it says, "Migration is not a crime." And migration isn't a crime, but all around it are things to do with the law and crime. You know, so if we obeyed the French police and the British authorities, no one would come into the country. No one would try to get on a lorry or cross on a boat. Everyone would apply for asylum in France, which is what the law says they must do. So I have a bit of a interesting relationship with the law when it comes to refugees. And I'm very much where an American David Thoreau basically was, that if the law's an ass, you need to challenge it and work around it. And I'd probably reference a bit of Jesus in that as well. That I've never worked out what he meant when he said, "I've come to fulfill the law," and then he broke it every 5 minutes. So I take that as the spirit of which we should perhaps operate. If someone's got any wisdom on that, I'd love to hear it. But you know, I think it's really interesting that there was a lot of illegality in the story of Ruth, according to the Deuteronomy bits I've read, but they were bypassed in interest of it. Can we argue a greater good? And I would argue the same about modern day scenarios, but I'm sure someone will come back to me on that one.
I think we could go down the avenue of what did Jesus mean by that very easily, but I'm keen that we don't get pulled too far away from the story of Ruth. I wonder whether it would be helpful. Thank you for all of those points, Nigel, and I think so much of what you shared and the parallels you've drawn really illuminate some aspects of the text that we might not have seen in Technicolor in the same way that you've brought them to life for us. So I wonder whether there would be value in us briefly splitting into breakout rooms and just having a few minutes with a couple of other people to just talk about some of what you've shared and how some of what you've shared has brought more out of the text. Or help them see things that they might not necessarily have seen. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop us in those rooms for about 5 minutes, just to give you a chance to kind of have your say and to reflect back, and then we'll come back together and maybe you can help us think through a little bit more of how does this then impact how we live, which I know, you know, that's your activist lens, right? Wanting to make sure that it's not just, we don't just engage with the story and walk away, but how can this change the way that we live now? Does that sound all right?
Yep, sounds good.
Great, okay. See you shortly, everyone. Hopefully you found them those some interesting conversations. It would be great to get a little bit of feedback from some of you about some of what was discussed. We haven't got time, unfortunately, to hear from every group, but if a few of you want to digitally raise your hands and we'll get feedback from a number. Anybody got any particular reflections on either some of the stories Nigel shared, or Alan, you've unmuted yourself.
While people are thinking, can I just, I had to disappear from my chat room because I got a phone call from my brother in South Africa, but so I don't know what they said. But following Nigel's comments on the camp in Calais, I just wonder if anybody else gets the newspaper, because in this morning's there's an amazing article by a guy who, with his two brothers, one older, one younger, left Afghanistan about 20 years ago, partly because his 12-year-old brother had some heart problem. And when they arrived in this country, in Cardiff, the brother was taken to the hospital. And over the years, he's had 19 operations. and unfortunately he died when he was 32. So he had an extra 17 years to live, and this guy's full of praise for the NHS. And the brother that died eventually became a governor of Bristol Hospital. And it's an amazing story of how, I mean, it took them 18 months to get from Afghanistan to England. Just an amazing story of determination and of the welcome they found when the brother needed this desperate treatment, you know. That's in this morning's eye.
Thanks for that, Alan. It's good to have some positive stories as well as some of the kind of slightly negative images that we may focus on as well. John, you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something, and then we'll hear from Kim?
Well, I think sort of going on from our chat room, the question of being exhausted, trying to absolutely be fair to all the situations we find challenging and getting the right facts. And where do we get our information from? You know, it's fascinating hearing Nigel's first-hand experience in Calais. I've never been to Calais, but never seen the camps. We can't all of us step into all the situations to get a first-hand experience. So we're dependent on what we're fed with. And that raises the question, well, where do we turn to for our information?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And a challenge, because we will always hear things through someone's lens, right? So actually learning to accept that, learn to critically engage with it, but also learning that that means there's always another version of the story which is worth hearing, I think is a really important learn actually out of this whole series for us. So thank you for that. Kim, what were your reflections?
Well, I was in the same room as John, and I was just going to let him know it was Robert Warren's book, The Healthy Church's Handbook, because one of the questions we discussed, double thumbs up from Nigel there, was around, when we're being called into mission and there's so much going on and so much that makes our heart ache, how do we choose? And one of the things from the Healthy Church Handbook is to decide to do one thing and do it wholeheartedly. So we find that, we recognize we can't do everything. So we find out one thing that calls to us, and then we commit to it until we too are exhausted. And so that's a really good part about what we can do as individuals and as churches in that missional community. So it is Robert Warren, The Healthy Church's Handbook.
There's a Methodist version of that, which is for circuits. Someone's taken Robert Warren's work and methodized it. So if there are any links or notes, we might find that and put it on, add to what Michael sends out. So.
Yeah, that would be good. I'm keen, Nigel, that we hear from you and some of your reflections on that topic, actually, of kind of what are some of the one things that we can be doing. But if we just take a final thought from Cesar and then hear back from you, Cesar.
Well, just to say that, in a sense, following what Kim was saying just now, I think it is essential that we just don't do whatever we feel that or think that is appropriate wholeheartedly. I think we have to absolutely see what other people are doing before we start moving our hands or foot or whatever it is. So it's absolutely, we cannot do it on isolation. That's a typical thing that charities want to do, to fulfill themselves instead of thinking what is right for the community. And I think the gospel calls us to look around and see what is right and do it together with other people.
Yeah, and I think there's a real skill, isn't there, in community profiling and surveying the landscape and knowing what's out there and knowing what's not out there and finding a niche and all of that actually I think is part of discerning calling, not just what's the one idea that I've spontaneously had that I can act upon.
Yes, I think I'm talking about England. What can we do in England, not anywhere else? Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Nigel, do you want to lead us in some thoughts then on how can we begin to apply some of the lessons that you see at work in the book of Ruth in our own lives?
Yes, we'll try and squeeze this in very briefly, this can take 2 hours, so we'll try and do it in 2 minutes. This is to both add to your problems as to knowing what to do, but also hopefully, I think, might invite us to consider which 1 or 2 points we might do, and also respond to the situations we find ourselves in and the text. So it's a model which I came up with it after I'd done my PhD, because my PhD wasn't about this, but it was in the research. So I'll just offer it to you, and you can do with it what you wish. But at one level, to any problem we might face, be it the problem Naomi faced, Ruth faced, or we face ourselves, or people in Calais faces, we can have that compassionate response. We can give something, we can donate something, we can help someone, we can be there for them, and that's absolutely fantastic. And lots, in my experience, of Christians and others for that matter, do that. So that I want to applaud that, but I don't think it's the end of the story. I think there's a whole set of social conditions around which cause some of the problems in our world, caused Ruth some problems and Naomi some problems, and caused refugees some problems. We could name some of those specifically, and someone, somewhere, I think, has to respond to the call of God to challenge those social conditions. So I'm not trying to make political points per se, but I have been campaigning on behalf of young people and austerity for a long time now, because austerity's done so much damage to how young people are treated, for example. It's why we've got food banks. So it's great we give food to food banks, but we'll forever be giving food to food banks unless we can challenge the social conditions which people like the refugees, like some people in your community, and people like Ruth might find themselves in, if you like. Maybe gleaning was a Jewish response along the food bank issue. So some people are called to that, and that might be the one thing Kim talked about. That might be campaigning, writing to your MP, whatever it is you feel drawn into. But I think going a bit deeper, there's some ideologies which create the social conditions. We see this a lot at the moment. Some of the ones around at the moment are white supremacy, British nationalism. We could list a whole host of isms: capitalism, communism, neoliberalism, if you're so interested in things like that, exceptionalism. We could talk about things which we talked about perhaps earlier in these studies around money, sex and power. They can be our driving ideologies which create the conditions which cause some of the problems we have to tackle and respond to. And somebody, somewhere, hopefully, feels the call of God to challenge those ideologies. I notice as I'm talking, less and less Christians do this type of work. A lot do compassionate work, some challenge the social conditions, but less and less perhaps challenge the ideologies which are existing in our world. And if we really want to go deeper and give it a New Testament twist, we could discuss this for hours, but we won't. I just encourage you to perhaps take the text at the face value. As far as I can work out, there's a constant narrative in the New Testament that there's powers and principalities driving these ideologies. And somebody, somewhere, hopefully, feels the call to pray into these things, to fast, to bind, to loose, to stand on the promises of God, and to confront those powers and principalities. I don't say that naively. It's risky work, it's costly work, it can be dangerous work. But my argument is, unless someone challenges the social conditions, unless someone challenges the ideologies, unless someone travels the powers and principalities, we'll forever have the problems. And I know you don't want to go to the New Testament, but I think Jesus did all of these things. He was compassionate, he challenged the social conditions, for example, around gender, which again we might see in the story of Ruth. He challenged the ideology around who had the power and who was calling the shots in terms of social and economic things. And he also engaged in the most costly of ways in some of the powers and principalities in the heavenlies and the cosmos to steal the Greek language, which the writers of the New Testament draw on. So I say we could unpack that for hours. I could give you lots of supporting information and so forth, but I just offer it to you as a way of responding to the call of God, to delving into the text, perhaps at a deeper level, and to enabling us to do that one or two things, which Kim says. If you're stupid like me, you might go for all four, and then you really will get exhausted. But there you go. It's good fun, isn't it?
It's brilliant. Thanks,
That's
Nigel.
my reflection on where we're at.
Thank you. And I think if you just leave that model up just for a second, I think one of the things that I would encourage is that if we were to try and capture your lens that you bring to text, you could replace the word problem at the center of that and put the word passage, and then actually look at, okay, so what are people's responses within the passage and within kind of modern day to the passage, but then also what are the social conditions, the ideologies and the powers and principalities that are at work behind that text. That would actually be a really useful exegetical tool, to use fancy unnecessary language. So thank you for that, and thank you for drawing our attention to everything that you have done today. If you're able to stop sharing, and I'll draw our session to a close in full size. That's great. Brilliant. So we have come to the end of our series on Ruth. Again, just really grateful to all of you for joining us, not just so that we're not just talking to ourselves, but actually I feel like we've learned a lot from you, and we've valued your contributions over the last 4 weeks as well. I do trust that you have engaged with the text in new ways. I trust that you have new revelations about it, but I also hope that it's been helpful for you to reflect on yourself and your discipleship and your community, and what it looks like for you to faithfully engage with the Bible and faithfully follow Jesus in your day-to-day. I think that is the beauty of taking the time to read the text, is hopefully we always end up finding ourselves in those more application-based questions, and some of what Nigel shared has particularly been helpful to kind of leave us, I think, in that point. Would love to hear some feedback from you about how you have found the last few weeks. If you'd be up for maybe dropping me an email, or I may well ping out a little survey at some point in the next week or so, just to find out how you found it. We're always keen to learn and to develop the work that we're doing, and we'll probably look to do Bible Month similarly to this next year maybe. So it would be great to get some feedback, both positive and negative. Give us some ideas about how things could be better. That would be great. But other than that, just want to say thank you. Nigel and I will stick around for a little bit. If you want to ask any questions or kind of come back at us on anything, then that would be great. We'll stop the recording now, but bless you. I hope you've enjoyed your 30 days with Ruth, and next year we look forward to our 30 days with Mark. It's going to be great. All right, take care.